Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
This is a talk about unidentified flying objects. And as you can perhaps see from the subtitle, I'm looking at images that may or may not need an extraterrestrial explanation. I'm not going to be looking at alien abduction or reports of alien sightings. I'm just looking at images that may or may not be UFOs. So let's start with a few statistics. And the only statistics I could find are those from America, where American individuals were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? And 40% said yes. This is a survey, as you can see from the bottom, carried out at Chapman University in 2018. 40% of Americans think that extraterrestrial aliens have visited Earth in the past. And if asked how many are visiting now, a slightly lower value of 35% said, we think that the aliens are currently amongst us. Now, 35% or 40% is clearly a very large number. It's less than the number who believe in ghosts, apparently, from the same survey, but it's greater than the number of people who believe in telekinesis or in Bigfoot. And the most scary statistic that came out of that particular survey is that the number of people who believe aliens are visiting us now is greater than the number of people who believe in evolution. That is the scariest statistic I've come across in a long, long time. But it has been said, surely UFOs, isn't it the same as the Loch Ness Monster and everything else? If you look at how many cameras are with people these days, the percentage of people walking around with the camera, it was almost zero up till the turn of the millennium, but since 2000, the number of people who've had a camera on them all the time has gone rocketing up to nearly 100%. So doesn't that mean that we've now conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, Loch Ness Monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, etc.? Surely if they existed, we'd have lots and lots of pictures rather than relying on very old, very grainy, very jerky images. So it should be settled, but apparently, no, it's not. If you do a Google search for UFO, you find something like 250 million web pages dedicated to UFOs. That implies that, despite the fact that we all have a camera pretty much all the time, this issue is not settled. And in this talk, I'm going to look at what UFO images could actually be. Maybe they are actually man-made objects. Maybe these UFOs are natural objects. Maybe they are nothing out there at all, but are purely artifacts in the imaging system within the camera itself. And possibly some UFO images are deliberately faked. And of course, there is a fifth possibility, and the fifth possibility is that they are actually extraterrestrial spacecraft. And I'm going to look at each of those in turn. But first, let's just make sure we understand what we're talking about. I will conform to the convention of using the word UFO to mean an object observed in the sky that is not readily identified. And in terms of whether or not it has an extraterrestrial origin, I will side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And another useful tool for any rational scientist is Occam's razor, which states, if there are two explanations for an observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is usually better. And that's often paraphrased to something like, simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. So if an image has two possible explanations, I will usually side with the simpler of the two. How do you get reliable information on UFOs? That's part of the problem. Even with all of these cameras in existence at the moment, it's still difficult to get reliable UFO information. One option is to go to your local UFO information center, and you can see the gentleman on the bench there on the left. That's presumably who you talk to get the information. But outside of America, it's very difficult to get any sort of useful information. We would like UFO images to be nice and clear and detailed and in focus with no camera shake and well exposed. preferably in daylight rather than nighttime. So if we got an image like that, we would be fairly convinced that that is a really weird thing hanging in the sky, and maybe that's the result of aliens visiting us. But unfortunately, that's not what a typical UFO image actually looks like. That's what we would think of as ideal. What we tend to have to deal with is something more like that. It's usually blurred, usually out of focus. There's usually a lot of camera movement, and it's usually overexposed. And if you blow up an image like that, well, you don't learn anything new. Instead of a small blob, you end up with a large blob. And possibly 90% or more of UFO images fall into that category, where you can learn absolutely nothing by looking at the image itself. There's usually a story attached to the image, but I regard anecdotal evidence as being unreliable. I prefer to let the images talk for themselves. So was this the first UFO? I did a little big digging to see when I could unearth the earliest UFO. And here we have some hieroglyphs which quite clearly show what is something akin to an Apache helicopter in the top left, and something that looks to me a bit like Luke Skywalker's speeder on the right there, and maybe a Zeppelin or something else below. Is this the result of UFOs floating around during the days of the Old Kingdom? I wondered whether or not this was the result of Photoshop, but apparently that is a genuine hieroglyph. And the explanation is more interesting than simply somebody has photoshopped some interesting objects. It's the result of two pharaohs having a fight with each other. Seti I wanted his hieroglyphs, and at a different time, Ramesses II wanted a different set of hieroglyphs. And one set was not completely chiseled out before the others were put in. And if you combine the two in different colors, Seti in blue, Ramesses in green, you can see that the helicopter and the speeder and the Zeppelin are not really there. They're just the fortuitous overlap of rather more mundane hieroglyphs. So a bit of a disappointment, but no, the Egyptians aren't the first to have recorded UFOs in the sky. Let's have a look at whether or not UFOs might be man-made objects. The US Air Force is aware of the fact that people see UFOs, and they provided this very handy aircraft identification chart, just in case you actually see one of their super secret spy planes. They're trying to convince you that there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything you might see in the sky. So if we start with this object up in the top left, it's clear what that object actually is. It's a weather balloon. And the second one is a weather balloon. And the third one is a weather balloon. The fourth one is a weather balloon. The fifth one is a weather balloon. Any ideas on what the sixth one might be? Swamp gas. And then we have a weather balloon, and then a weather balloon, then a weather balloon, and a weather balloon, and the next one is clearly a weather balloon, and finally, no, it's not a stealth aircraft, it's a weather balloon. So that is the US Air Force trying to make it easy for us to identify objects in the sky. So it's worth having that as a ready reckoner identification chart when you're outside at night. But of course, who could see that and not think UFO? There are various objects. This is a man-made object. This is the trail of a Falcon launch from, I think it was a couple of years ago. And the exhaust from the rocket, when it reaches the high atmosphere, can produce very interesting trails that get left behind. And here's a beautiful image of a launch of a Falcon rocket some many minutes after launch over, I can't remember, no, that's not Los Angeles, that's somewhere else. And Falcon trails and Falcon tails were very popular a little while ago when Falcons were producing some very interesting trails in the sky. If you catch them at the right time, if the Falcon rocket is launched at the right time of day, you can find that the Falcon is then visible in the night sky, but the sunlight is still catching its tails, and you can end up with some rather spectacular images. So again, if you saw that without knowing what it was you were looking at, it would be very easy to think that it was some extraterrestrial explanation. But no, it's just a nebula produced by the exhaust from a Falcon rocket. Rocket trails might appear to be almost straight lines, but by the time a little bit of time has passed, the winds in the upper atmosphere will distort the contrail, and in this particular case, the sun is just catching the trail and producing these rather wonderful iridescent colors. So again, if you didn't know what you were looking at, that could be quite an unusual sight. This is a picture from Astronomy Picture of the Day. You can see the reference down in the bottom right-hand corner. And here, some sounding rockets have been launched and releasing gas into the high upper atmosphere. I think this particular gas was fluorescent, so that the sun made it glow these various colors. And the idea was this was a scientific experiment to see how the very high altitude winds affect the movement of this gas by releasing pockets of the gas at various heights, and then watching these colored blobs, you can get an idea of what the high altitude winds are like. So this is a scientific experiment, which again, if you didn't know it was happening, would give you perhaps pause for thought. I'm not sure if you can work out the video. I hope will play reasonably smoothly. Can you figure out what it is you're looking at here? The objects are moving at different speeds, regardless of whether the video is a little bit jerky or not.
Is it a weather balloon?
Good guess. This may or may not be becoming more popular in years to come. This is a whole set of drones, each of which has a light on it. And if you can arrange them to fly in formation, you can get some very interesting structures generated by a few dozen, or in some cases, perhaps a few hundred drones. If drones are becoming cheaper, it's perhaps more likely that people will do this as a bit of recreation. So not only Starlink satellites, we've got to watch out for these things as well. People have reported seeing what are clearly UFO landing sites on the ground, clearly from an aircraft here, as you can see over the top of the engine. But if you work out where you are, I think this particular site was in Nevada. If you actually go to Google Earth and start looking at what is actually on the ground at these sites, you realize that these unusual structures are just catching the sunlight because they are a whole vast array of mirrors arranged usually in circles, because these are solar energy plants out in the middle of the desert. So it can look a little bit odd from a distance, but once you zoom in and have a look at the detail, it's quite clearly these are nothing to do with UFOs. Here's a little snippet of a video that appeared on the American news for a while. Somebody who doesn't know that you shouldn't take video with your phone held vertically rather than horizontally. And he captured this UFO hovering over a lake, and apparently it made big news in America, because clearly this was a huge UFO that was defying gravity and hovering over a nearby town. Well, that was the story that ran for a little while, perhaps for 12 hours or so, until the following day when it was pointed out by Goodyear, sorry guys, don't want to get in the way of a good story, but I'm sorry, that's quite definitely us. So you can see the problem with the picture in the top left there. The resolution, either in individual photos or in videos, is so poor, you often can't actually see what it is, even if it's a common object, such as the Goodyear blimp, for instance. And that's possibly one of the most unusual UFOs you're going to see. If we're talking about unidentified flying objects, perhaps you're not very likely to see it, but people have put all sorts of things up into the sky. For instance, Nike took one of their trainers, launched it on a weather balloon and took it up to 100,000 feet. So basically, the only interesting thing about this is look up at the weather balloon. And that's what happens when the weather balloon shreds and the object then falls back to Earth. But the point is, there's all sorts of junk that could be up there, whether it be during the day or during the night. And you can't assume that a UFO is necessarily just a regular object. It could be almost anything that somebody has decided to throw into the air one way or another. When I did a little bit of background thinking, well, there's an awful lot of fuzzy images of UFOs. Is it possible to find something which shows a very clear UFO? Imagine my delight when I Googled and found something that claimed to be super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, wow, at last we have super clear footage, not something that's going to be jerky, not something that's going to be out of focus. Let's have a look at this wonderful footage. Here it comes. I would hazard a guess that's a camera on full zoom, and it's very difficult to keep a camera with 100-fold zoom or something like that very still. And so it's not at all obvious what that is. But later in this rather extended footage, it did settle down a bit, and eventually you can find out what this particular footage was imaging. And if we freeze frame at the end of the video, we can see that what it actually is well, it's either a J or it's a unicorn, but it's fairly obvious that it's a mylar balloon. It's reflecting the sun at a particular time of day, and it means that this particular balloon was visible from quite some distance away, and so you needed quite a zoom to actually pick it out, but it's quite clearly a man-made object and not a UFO. Let's move on from man-made objects to natural objects. Plenty of people have claimed to have seen UFOs, but are actually seeing just the effects of nature. Clouds of the month. Did you know that the Cloud Appreciation Society has a cloud of the month? Yes, both of those are real. Yeah. So for instance, January's cloud of the month was these lenticular clouds. November's was this rather interesting looking circular arrangement of a cloud on the bottom of a cloud layer. June was another lenticular cloud, which has often been confused with UFOs or mistaken for UFOs. That's quite a dramatic one from March. It reminds me of one of the scenes in Independence Day when a UFO, or at least an alien spacecraft, comes into the Earth's atmosphere and then hovers over a city. And in some cases, the clouds are inverse clouds, not an oval-shaped cloud, but an oval-shaped gap in a cloud layer, in that particular case, from September. And that is one of the most spectacular images I've seen of lenticular clouds over a mountain. For fans of Stargate, when the alien spacecraft comes down and settles over one of the pyramids of Giza, that's sort of the same thing. And again, if you weren't aware that this was a natural phenomena, perhaps you would find that quite a scary sight. But what's going on here? Have we got searchlights that are pointing vertically up into the sky? No, there's no searchlights on the ground. Is it a whole set of alien spacecraft in the sky who are beaming something down to ground level via these vertical shafts of light? No, in neither case. The clue here is the fact that you can see snow on the roofs and snow on the ground. This is a rather icy environment, and what's happening is we've got ice hanging in the atmosphere, and the ice crystals are small platelets, and those platelets are almost horizontal, which means light from distant street lights or any other lighting will reflect off those ice platelets and produce these light pillars, as they're known. Quite common in northern latitudes, especially when you have lots of ice around, but less common for us in the temperate part of Europe, for instance. And here we see another picture where again you see ice pillars in the distance. You see some of the pillars appear to be blue and some of them appear to be yellow. That's simply a question of what the light sources are, which in this particular case you can not see because they're hidden behind the trees. And so in a sense, the ice crystals are reflecting light from beyond our immediate horizon, and they are simply reflecting blue or orangey lights from a distance. We can perhaps see that even more clearly here, where the ice crystals are very high in the atmosphere. And so up here, we see the light pillars. And for each little line here, you can map it down to the particular light source in here at a great distance. You can see the light sources on the horizon are producing the reflections up here in the higher atmosphere. In some cases, the light pillars actually change. The ice crystals are very well oriented up to a particular height, but because of atmospheric conditions and perhaps a slight warming above that, the ice crystals then change at a particular height, and instead of all being horizontal, they start to become more randomly oriented, and the pillars then start to diffuse into these sort of funnels, if you like, and again, giving a very odd effect. In here, it's even more clear, perhaps, that each of these light pillars ends by following it down to the ground at a light source on the ground, nothing to do with light being generated in the sky. What about here? A video, again, a vertical video from somebody who doesn't know to hold the camera horizontal. What's going on here in the middle there? Something seems to be jumping around between the clouds. Do we have aliens zipping backwards and forwards? It seems to be very fast in some cases. Just a fraction of a second, something moves quite a considerable distance within the cloud. What's thought to be going on here is related to what we've just seen. It's thought that there are ice crystals in this region of the cloud, perhaps elsewhere as well, but the very large electric fields in this particular thundercloud are orienting the ice crystals, and in one orientation they reflect the sun, and in a slightly different orientation they don't reflect the sun, and so when we see the light fluctuating, it's simply a result of the different orientation of the ice crystals in the thundercloud changing because of the electric fields in the thundercloud. And perhaps lightning elsewhere that we don't see is producing a change that results in the light fluctuation. This is something we're unlikely to see by eye. These are red sprites. These are phenomena that are related to lightning, but whereas lightning usually is cloud to cloud or cloud to ground, these occur above thunderstorms. So in this particular case, there's a thunderstorm in the distance, which we can't really see. And way above, very high altitudes, are these so-called red sprites. Very difficult to see because they are very deep red, and our eyes are not particularly good at seeing that end of the spectrum. But if you have a camera that's sensitive to red, it is possible to pick these up if your camera is sensitive enough. So these were only known about in the last 1 or 2 decades or so. They've been seen a lot from space, and they've been captured from time to time by people on the ground. And again, if you didn't know what you were looking at, although they would be much fainter than indicated by this photograph, if you didn't know what you were looking at, it could be something that would be misinterpreted as perhaps a UFO. So here we have a UFO over Ontario, an arc-shaped UFO. I won't show you the picture yet. Here's the description from the person who took a photograph. Near the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye, brilliant white. So, would any amateur astronomers care to guess what you might see at the end of the day if you're facing west and you see a very bright spot in the sky? What could that possibly be? In truth, I cannot be sure. My conclusion, a UFO. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. Quite how you determine how large an object is when you don't know how far away it is, I don't know. But here, his friend thinks it's as big as 2 airliners. This individual disagreed. He thinks it's the size of 1 airliner. What was he looking at? Well, looking at that, a rather fuzzy image, but if it's a crescent object, very brilliant white, seen in the west at the end of the day, I think we can all conclude that that is simply Venus. The number of times Venus has been declared as a UFO, I think it's one of the highest objects, the highest percentage of objects ever confused with a UFO is a Venus in the evening sky and occasionally in the morning sky. Okay, we've looked at man-made objects and natural objects. UFOs might also be image artifacts, nothing to do with what's actually out there, but purely a result of how they've been photographed or imaged with either a video camera or a still camera. So this goes back a long way. It's got a tremendous history. 1952, there was a publication of these mysterious lights seen in the sky over Washington, DC in 1952. I say seen in the sky, but I don't think anybody actually saw them. Somebody took a picture and then saw that these objects were in the background and said, oh, I've captured a picture of a building with UFOs flying behind it. Nobody stopped to think, well, before we publish this picture and this story, perhaps we ought to look at these lights in the foreground, because if we were to take those lights and turn them upside down and then realize that, well, actually there's a 1-to-1 match. There's a light producing a reflection. There's 2 lights close together producing 2 reflections. There's 2 lights a little bit further apart producing 2 reflections, etc., etc. Each of those dots that appears to be a little fly buzzing behind the building is in fact just a reflection of the light in the foreground. Either the newspaper didn't stop to think about that, or they figured that they could sell more newspapers by going with the story rather than shooting it down immediately. Here's a very interesting image artifact. The person who took the picture claims that the large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. I presume they mean this window here with a little pilot smiling at you from the front there. So, UFO sighting, this was declared as 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. It must be important because aliens was capitalized, so that shows you just how important this particular report was. But before you look at an image like this and decide, well, that is really weird, I wonder what sort of flying green pod thing could possibly look like that, it's worth going to the full image, not a little blow up, not a crop, not a zoom of one part of the image, but ask yourself, what does the original image look like? And when you realize that somebody has photographed the full moon, and then the full moon has produced what appears to be a very distorted reflection, my guess is that this was photographed with a camera that did not have multi-coated lenses or elements of lenses, and hence we're getting a very strong and very distorted reflection of center of a very bright object that has been overexposed. That is a very common way of picking up image artifacts in any photograph, whether it be a photograph on film or a more recent photograph on a CCD camera. For instance, this is a relatively recent image of what appears to be a UFO hovering in the sky when this person took the image. They said, I think this was on Twitter, what is this in the sky? It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? And it was accompanied by the hashtag UFO. And just to show that this particular individual was open-minded, it also had the hashtag serious question. In other words, I really do want to know the answer to this. I'm not saying it's a UFO. I would really like to know what people think. And in this particular case, if we take that, that little object with an aura around it and blow it up, you could say, well, yes, this is clearly a spaceship, and there's a window on this side, and don't know what that is on that side, but seems to have a couple of legs. So either this is clearly a UFO, a ship of some kind, or you can look at it and say, playing devil's advocate or using Occam's razor, well, look, the sun is shining through the edge of the wall there, through the bracket holding the lamp. And if you've got sun shining into your camera, you're almost certain to have a reflection, either a bright reflection or a dim reflection. Look at the structure we've got there. Is it not possible that the sun is simply shining through the filigree work on the support here, this bracket that's holding up the lamp? If the sun is shining through the filigree work on the lamp, is that not what we are seeing here when we look at these curves? We are getting a big circle cut off by the building. Remember, the reflection is upside down. So there's a big disk of the sun cut off by the building, and we're seeing the filigree work of the stand there. So a very simple explanation for that, which is nothing to do with an object floating in the sky there. This is perhaps one of my favorite explanations. This individual, again, published this, this particular report, I think it was in a newspaper, saying there appears to be a very large, flat, rectangular aircraft with lights around its edges hovering in the air. So this was photographed, and there's this huge object in the sky with a whole load of lights reflecting off its rather reflective edges. And UFO enthusiasts jumped on this and said, yes, this is obviously an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. So clearly these are so well known, they've all got their own little acronyms as to what they are meaning. So either this is a large slab floating in the sky with a little metallic edge to it, or Occam's razor. There might be a simpler explanation. This is clearly photographed through a car windscreen because you can see the raindrops on the windscreen from the car headlights in front of you. If this is photographed through a windscreen, is it possible that it's a reflection of something on the dashboard? Is it possible it's just an iPhone sitting on the dashboard of the car, reflecting in the windscreen? So either it's a spy craft known as a TR-3B, or it's an iPhone. I know which I believe. So we've gone through man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts. Unfortunately, these days, it is possible to fake images. So perhaps images were faked in the past, but it's getting more and more difficult because image processing and image manipulation is getting more and more sophisticated. So can we tell if an image is fake? Well, if you need a finger pointing at the UFO, then I think we could all agree that that's probably not a real UFO. If somebody was photographing an object in the sky, I don't think they would take the time to hold the camera in one hand and then point their finger from their other hand up at the object. If we saw something like that, again, I think we could probably agree that's a rather nice example of using Photoshop to produce a fake image. I would hazard a guess that if an object actually that size appeared in the skies over America, I think a lot of people would notice it. So again, I don't think an image like that can be taken seriously. This is supposedly an image taken from a great distance away, which is why it's a little bit grainy, a little bit fuzzy. This is supposed to be two triangular shaped UFOs that are shadowing Air Force One as it's coming into land at Washington. I believe this is fake for a number of reasons, but two of them are the fact that if you look in detail at Air Force One, you can see it's a little bit blurred because of distance. The contrast is not particularly high because of distance. But if you look at the UFOs, they are rather better defined in terms of their outline than Air Force One. If these are objects flying at a similar distance to Air Force One, then they should be blurred by the atmosphere in pretty much the same way. And the lack of contrast of an object at a great distance, again, is the result of the atmosphere between you and the object. So if these objects are supposed to be shadowing Air Force One, they are at a similar distance, and so the contrast ought to be a little lower. So they appear to be too sharp and too dark to be genuine objects that are actually flying behind Air Force One. So I believe that is a fake as well. Here's a rather nice image of a helicopter, an F-18 jet sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier, and what appears to be a triangular UFO spacecraft sitting there as well. In my research, what I spend a lot of time doing is image processing and image analysis. Image analysis involves what information can you actually pull out of an image that tells you something about what it is that you're imaging. So in this case, I thought, I wonder if it's possible to take that image and prove that this thing is not actually there. So what I did was I looked at certain pixel values. Let me show you what I did first. I looked at the pixel values running along a line, in this case, the gray area close to the jet. I believe the jet is real. I believe this part of the deck is real. And what I did was look at the intensity of pixels along the line that I'm now tracing out with the cursor, basically along the line of the deck of the carrier. And if we look here in this graph, the vertical scale tells us how bright a pixel is, and the horizontal scale is where we are along the line, in this case, from 0 to 70 pixels along somewhere there, 0 to 70 pixels. And you can see the intensity goes up and down and up and down. It's a little bit noisy, but that's exactly what you would expect from a real image. You would expect one pixel to be slightly different from its neighbor because of JPEG artifacts and because of normal natural variations in light levels. You would expect a real surface, even though it's all nominally the same shade of gray, you would expect to get that sort of variation. So that looks real to me. But if we look over here at what's going on right next door to the UFO, we find that if we do the same trick and look at the variation here, we find it looks perfectly natural. And then what's going on here? The pixel variation doesn't change one iota and then starts going back to normality. So the pixels in this region of the image have quite definitely been manipulated. They have been changed, probably as the result of copying and pasting this picture of the spacecraft onto the deck of the carrier. So I can quite unequivocally say that that image is fake simply by analyzing the pixel data. And there's many other fake images that you could in principle do the same with. Here's one that appeared on YouTube. I won't show you the video, that's not particularly relevant. There was an image of a UFO right in the middle of the image here. And again, it's very difficult to see what's going on. So with a bit of image processing, I processed it such that it revealed a little more detail as to what we have there. All of this mottling that you can see in the background is perfectly normal. Either you would call it JPEG artifacts or you would call it noise, depending on what it is you're describing. But this variation that we can see, because I've exaggerated the color scale so much, this is perfectly normal noise that you would expect to see in any real image. But notice this black rectangle that is the supposed UFO. Note how sharp its outline is. It is very sharp, much sharper than any of these blobs that you can see in the background. If this was a UFO and subject to the same result of processing that was in the camera that took this image, you would expect this edge to be as rough as any of these little blobs and variations that you can see elsewhere in the image. This triangle is far too sharp to be real. It is quite definitely fake. And so for the same reason as last time, we can rule that out as simply a modern bit of image manipulation. And here's another example. It's perhaps not so obvious, but a picture from an aircraft. It's actually part of a video, but again, I won't bore you with the video. But here's a passing object which is claimed to be a UFO. But if you look at it closely, well, yes, it sort of obeys all the rules for a UFO until you realize it bears a striking resemblance to the sort of craft that you get in various popular arcade games, whether it be PC or Xbox or whatever. It is fairly obvious that somebody has taken a craft from a military craft from a video game and manipulated it and simply placed it into this picture taken out of the window of a commercial aircraft. So again, not really believable. So I've been through the four of man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, and fakery. And that only leaves us with one possibility. If it's not the previous four, then maybe the UFO that we've been looking at is an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Well, apparently there's an awful lot of them around. You can tell that from looking at this particular chart, which actually gives you a ready reckoner on specifying if you do see a UFO flying and it doesn't seem to fit the bill for an aircraft or anything else, then you can give it its proper designation. What I find interesting about this is twofold. One is the fact that there are a lot of them. There are 80 UFO models. And it's also based on actual sightings. But the other thing I find interesting is that this is set one. So there are presumably hundreds more of UFO shapes that could in principle be seen and, according to this particular publication, have been based on actual sightings. I really don't like the sort of things that appear on TV where somebody says, here we have evidence, not just the sighting of a UFO. Here we have evidence. It's clear that these three black blobs here in this forest are clearly the results of the three landing legs of a triangular UFO. And they even zoom in on that region just to convince you that clearly that was a triangular UFO that landed in this particular forest and produced those three little dark spots on the ground. The fact that you can walk into any forest and pick out 3 blobs on the ground doesn't seem to put people off claiming that this is evidence of a UFO landing. And I do start to despair when people start reaching out to that sort of evidence to back up their claims of UFO sightings. Give me an image, I can see what's there. When people start making claims like that, then that's getting very desperate. So what about extraterrestrials? Let me just finish with a thought. If there's no evidence for any UFOs being extraterrestrial in origin, well, why not? Why don't we have evidence of UFOs? Why don't we have evidence of aliens visiting? How many stars are there in the Milky Way? Let's say about 300 billion stars. That's a reasonable estimate. And we now know that a lot of them have planetary systems. It would appear to be at least half of them have planetary systems. So that means 150 planetary systems. So that means 150 billion planetary systems, and most planetary systems have more than one planet. How many of them might be like Earth? If we think that only Earth-like planets will be a good place for life to start, well, a surprisingly large number. Something like 1/3 of those are Earth-like. So that means, as of a few decades ago, we didn't really know how many planets were out there in the Milky Way. We now have a very good estimate, and the estimate is 50 billion Earth-like planets are out there in the Milky Way. What we really don't know is how likely it is that life evolves. Maybe 99% of the time, even if the conditions are right and we have an Earth-like planet, maybe 99% of the time, nothing happens. So let's assume that life only originates 1% of the time. That gives us 500 million. Maybe life finds it difficult to get a foothold, and maybe life doesn't develop into more complex forms. Maybe 99% of the time, life doesn't develop into complex life. So let's divide by another factor of 100. Complex life would be 5 million planets. And maybe complex life, maybe that's as far as it gets, but maybe it never develops into intelligent life. Maybe 99% of the time you do get complex life, it never goes any further. So maybe intelligent life is, again, only a 1% chance, 50,000. So I'm assuming that starting with an Earth-like planet, the chances of ending up with some intelligent life is only 1 in a million. That might be wrong, it might be 1 in a billion. But if it is 1 in a million, that means there are 50,000 Earth-like planets. So the galaxy surely should be full of civilizations. So where are they? Is the fact that we haven't seen UFOs that appear to have an extraterrestrial origin, is that the result of either this equation being wrong, or I've completely overestimated the chance of life developing, or perhaps life does develop, but maybe civilizations simply don't last long enough for us to ever see the results of those civilizations. Maybe intelligent life is popping up all over the galaxy, but for whatever reason, it doesn't last long enough for them to visit us and produce some UFOs, which are genuinely extraterrestrial in origin. So there we are. That is the pale blue dot. That's us. Look again at the dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The pale blue dot, quote from Carl Sagan, 1994. Maybe the pale blue dot is unique. Maybe we don't have any neighbors in the Milky Way. I believe we do, but UFOs aren't evidence that any of them have ever visited us. Thank you all very much.